certainly have fears that there is a serial killer at loose in Perth.
Sarah Spears, Jane Rimmer, Ciara Glennon.
And every time you saw a young girl walking by, you think, oh God, is she going to be the next victim?
Now, one man stands accused.
If police are right and Edwards is the Claremont serial killer, he's been hiding in plain sight for 20 years.
Today, Justice Hall quizzed the details of the defence's alibi theory for the night Ciara disappeared, with the trial expected to finish as early as tomorrow. Welcome to day 94 of Claremont in Conversation with Alison, Natalie and Tim. So we've heard a dozen or so witnesses testify to seeing a woman matching Ciara's description on Stirling Highway the night she went missing. But today, Mr Yovich questioned whether they all saw the same person. Tim, what was his reasoning there?
Well, he pointed to various discrepancies in the accounts, Nat, the descriptions of the car, the descriptions of the woman that was seen walking, and the position of that person that some of the witnesses had seen. So, yeah, look, he was doing his due diligence, I suppose, going through witness by witness, and he did go through witness by witness and recounted their evidence, reading from the transcript. And ultimately, his point was that Justice Hall, on his argument, couldn't be sure that all of those witnesses saw the same person or the same car, and ultimately they couldn't be sure, or he couldn't be sure, that what was being generally described by the prosecution as Ciara leaning into this car on Stirling Highway and then ultimately disappearing. Paul Yovich said ultimately, from those varying witness descriptions, that conclusion could not be solidly and, beyond a reasonable doubtedly drawn.
And Ali, he also questioned whether the witness recollections would have maybe been influenced by the missing appeals that they'd seen on television.
I counted probably around 14 witnesses, both those walking down outside the hotel and the motorists and those coming home from various functions that were driving along Stirling Highway. And it was such a massive variety of descriptions. I mean, they got her clothing right, they got her appearance right. But as for the vehicles, we went from a Ford Ute with a canopy and a tailgate being lifted up down to a Commodore sedan, to a Commodore station wagon. But what Paul Yovich pointed out was that not one of these witnesses mentioned any sort of Telstra logos, markings on the car. And he said this was at a time when Justice Hall questioned, maybe they were looking at other things. He said, well, this was a time when Telstra changed its branding from Telecom to Telstra, and it had quite a large, good-sized logo right over the bonnet of the front and on both passenger doors, and not one mentioned any markings of any kind, even though they described vehicles every kind. They described the white, light-coloured car. But it was, I think he was pointing out how unreliable eyewitnesses can be when they all see something completely different. And the two most credible were ones who actually had to pull out and drive slowly around this white car that was parked in the actual driving lane, just past the intersection of Bayview Terrace and Stirling Highway. They actually had to pull around it, and this was a couple who'd come back from a movie night, so others were saying they'd probably been drinking quite a bit, but they were the ones that also gave quite a different description of the driver. So he was very strong in pointing those points out.
Tim, did Justice Hall have anything to say about the fact that the witnesses hadn't necessarily seen a Telstra logo? Did he question the importance of that?
Yeah, he did, Nat, and quite rightly as well. But he did point out that, as much as you want to take every witness account into account, some you get the impression immediately are better or stronger accounts than others. And Justice Hall pointed to, as the prosecution has and as we have, the account of the three young gents in the bus stop eating their burgers, the so-called burger boys, and said, well, they were stationary, so they weren't moving. Yes, they'd been drinking, but they all were looking at the same thing from basically the same vantage point. And their accounts, or at least two of the accounts that we heard, were pretty close together. in factual terms. But again, what Mr. Yovich just pointed out, as Ali pointed out, was neither of those people, neither of those men noted or registered or placed in any statement a Telstra logo on the car, even though other details of the car that they relayed were very detailed. The fact that it was, wraparound white bumpers, the fact that there were teardrop cutouts on some of the on the rims on the car. But Mr. Yovich said, well, so why then, Your Honour, wouldn't these gents see a Telstra logo? And Justice Hall's come back to that was, well, maybe they were just looking at other features on the car. Maybe they were more focused on the car itself, and it was a relatively new model. And one of the Burger Boys, if you remember, was actually looking to buy this make and model of car for himself, so he was particularly interested in that make and model. So Justice Hall surmised or opined, well, maybe he was just looking at the bumpers. Maybe he was more focused on the teardrop rims rather than on the logos themselves.
And obviously there were so many of these witnesses who, said they'd seen a woman matching Ciara's description. Did Mr. Yovich make anything of the fact that there's not an actual eyewitness account of a woman getting into a car?
He went quite, I think probably the Burger Boys were the ones who actually saw, I guess it was Ciara Glennon leaning over and talking to somebody in the van. And what Paul Yovich pointed out quite strongly there was this so-called propensity that the prosecution is very keen to include in reasons why Bradley Edwards was the killer and not only the rapist, was that this was not his modus operandi. He didn't sort of gently drive along and pick up someone and talk to them about getting into his car, that he'd only shown previously that he'd snatched and abducted someone off the streets and was covertly doing these things, that this car was just driving along. And I think that was the point where it was probably the most credible one with the Burger Boys, because they actually saw her walking across, and then the next time they looked up, they weren't paying all that much attention, except they did call out and say to her, because they said she had her arm out like she was hitchhiking, how stupid it was to be hitchhiking in an area, as was one of the other comments, was when he saw someone getting into this ute, he said, well, what's gone into this area, why are they doing that? But that particular one could be, as you say, someone picking up their daughter, as many of the parents did at that time. A different car, different daughter, different person. But I think the Burger Boys one was probably the most reliable or credible, is that they saw her, then they saw her leaning in, and then off it drove. They were really paying attention to eating and nothing more. Yeah.
Well, Mr. Yovich then turned to Bradley Edwards' whereabouts on the night of Ciara's disappearance. Tim, can you talk us through this portion, because it was again very detailed but very interesting in that Justice Hall interrupted here several times.
Yeah. So this was Mr. Yovich, a little bit like he did with Ciara, sort of floating a potential alibi, but not really nailing his colours to the mast and providing what he said would be a rock solid alibi. And this is for the night that Ciara went missing. So his argument was, we'll have to do a little bit of a recap here.
A little timeline would be good. Yeah.
Yeah. So Mr. Edwards was at that time in a relationship with an older woman that he'd met after his first wife had left him. They'd been seeing each other since about December 1996. It was a semi-serious relationship, and had continued for the months into the new year in 1997. The couple they'd gone down to the Margaret River, which is a beautiful wine region south of Perth, in the February. And this girlfriend at the time, who did give evidence in the trial, in that evidence said it was after that trip in around about the February that she felt their relationship had changed. It had fizzled out. And then she crucially said that her recollection was that the relationship had officially ended in early April 1997, when Mr. Edwards had come to her one night and said, I don't want to see you anymore. I've met someone else, and gave her name to the girlfriend, the name of the new person that she'd met. So this is in the April. Now, we know that Ciara went missing, obviously, middle of March. What Mr. Yovich attempted to argue today was that potentially the night that Ciara went missing was the night of that breakup. And the girlfriend at the time had got her dates wrong. And he tried to sort of, well, I'll say shoehorn in some dates and backtrack it by saying, well, she said it was about a month, and it had been about a month since they'd come back from Margaret River, and so that sort of fit that timeline. But Justice Hall immediately jumped on this and said, hold on, what did you say? Because not only had Mr. Edwards' former girlfriend had been very solid on the dates because it was close to her own daughter's birthday, she'd also then given the name.
That's right, yeah.
In evidence of the person that Mr. Edwards said he had met. And so Justice Hall said, well, so if this is right, not only is Mr. Edwards told a lie about why he's breaking up with her, i.e., that he hasn't met someone, he's also given her a name of someone who then eventually ends up to be the right name because that's the person that he ended up meeting. Right. And so we were all scratching our heads. I think Justice Hall was scratching her head. And look, if I'm being kind, I don't think it was Mr. Yovich's strongest point of argument over the last 5 days that he's been doing his closings.
Did he manage to back himself in any way?
I don't know. What would you say, Ali? I'd say no.
I'd just say the name was strikingly the same, wasn't it?
Yeah. Look, I would. What I would say is he stuck to his guns, and when he summed up his whole line of argument today, he maintained that it was a reasonably, it was a reasonable argument to make that March the 14th might have been or could have been the night when Mr. Edwards split up with his girlfriend, meaning that he wouldn't have been out driving around in Claremont picking up lone girls.
Well, of course, the prosecution has always said that these disappearances and murders of these girls coincided with traumatic emotional breakups and incidents in Bradley Edwards' life, but none of these breakups seem to be all that devastating or traumatic to either party.
Yeah.
When you listen to both sides, it would all sort of seem very amicable.
Amicable, that's right. If you'd like a recap on that portion of the evidence, that's actually way back in episode 4, which is ex-wives and ex-lives. Mr. Yovich said he also, that it didn't make sense logistically in terms of the distances Mr. Edwards would have had to have travelled.
Well, yeah, so he, again, much like he did...
The Ciara ones,
outlining Ciara, he turned to logic or what he would say would be an illogical series of thought processes for why Mr. Edwards would have chosen that night to go out and for what would have happened after he's allegedly picked up Ciara. The lack of logic in the night would be that he had somewhere to be the following day, as he did with Ciara. We know with Ciara the argument was, well, he knew he had to be at work the following day. In this circumstance, Mr. Yovich said, well, he knew he had to be at a friend's house in Dawesville the following day because that night and the following day because he'd been invited there by Murray and Bridget Cook. So that was one piece of logic. And then he said, well, look, let's say that he has picked up Ciara and killed her. Why would he choose to drive almost 50 kilometres north of Perth to dump the body when he knew that he would have been driving south anyway because Dawesville, which was where he was supposed to be that night, to be with the Cooks, to go and visit the Cooks and spend the night with the Cooks, was south of Perth. So why would he have chosen that spot of all to dump the body where it would basically add 100 kilometres and, at least a couple of hours, you would have thought, to his journey when he'd already allegedly dumped one body south of the river. And if he was going to do that and head down to Dawesville, why wouldn't he have done that again? So that's the logic argument. But as I've recapped before, Carmel Barbagallo in her closing said, we're not talking about logical events here. We're talking about a man who's going, snatching women for a sexual purpose, murdering them and dumping them. So,
and Justice Hall also pulled him up too about the distance. Said maybe he was just distancing himself from as far away as he could from the murders. Yeah.
That in fact, was he making the point that it was potentially a calculated decision to do that?
Yeah, to distance himself as far as possible away from wherever the bodies were.
So how did Mr. Yovich sum up his arguments in the case with Ciara?
Well, much like Ms. Barbagallo has been asking Justice Hall to not take one piece of evidence as the absolute killer piece, but to layer them all on top of each other. So Mr. Yovich made a similar argument when he was addressing all the points that he made about Ciara. And he said that, look, you might not think one of these pieces of what we say are discrepancies would cause you to have a reasonable doubt. But he said, if you put them all together, then we say there should be enough there to create a reasonable doubt. And it is the prosecution's job to counter those doubts. And their argument was that in Ciara's case, they would say the prosecution hasn't done that. And so Mr. Edwards should be acquitted.
And Mr. Yovich then finished the day by asking for an early adjournment. Do you know what that was about?
Well, only because he has finished with the Ciara Glennon issue, and he will now move on to the fibre evidence, that very, very complex fibre evidence, which he has promised us he'll only take tomorrow to tackle. And
do you believe him?
Well, it depends too how often Justice Hall comes in with a very long question. It goes on to a legal argument that comes backwards and forwards. So we don't know, but he has said that he'll sum up the fibre tomorrow and then has just a few more points to bring home, and we should be finished by tomorrow, at the latest, I hope, Friday morning.
Yeah, Mr. Yovich had asked, this might seem a backwards way of doing it, but he'd actually asked for more time out of court so he could pare down the time they would spend in court. So I think he was I get the impression he's been doing some pruning or some paring down maybe of his arguments around the fibres, because, if he let himself, I'm sure he could probably go for another 5 days talking about them. No one wants to do that. So I think he was asking for the indulgence of the court just to be given a little more time in front of the laptop, maybe, or in front of his MacBook just to really concentrate his thoughts on the fibres, so that it actually court time would be better spent. Really getting to the nub of those points.
Be interesting to see if the evidence that took longer than anything else, the fibre evidence, can be narrowed down to a few hours tomorrow.
That's your wishful thinking. What was it like in the courtroom today? I mean, can you sense the stresses and the pressure as we get closer to the finish?
Look, I get the impression everyone's just very weary now.
Yeah.
The families are still there and they're hanging in there.
Yeah. They are. They are, but I think everyone, it's like you can see, when you can see the light at the end of the tunnel, but it's not quite within reach. I think everyone is sort of anticipating and knowing that we are very, very close to the end now.
Yeah.
And sometimes they're the hardest steps to walk, aren't they? The ones that really will get you over the line. I know for a fact that Miss Barbagallo is weary, as you would expect her to be. She admitted as much to us last week. She's obviously spent the last few days listening and pondering on what Mr. Yovich has said, and even Justice Hall was asking for a sort of just a gentle signpost as whether we'll be finishing this week or not yesterday. So yeah, look, I think everyone is just looking forward to crashing through that finish line now.
You've also got an extraordinary large number of detectives and police who are taken out of their normal day-to-day jobs, sitting there, and they've been there since last November. Senior detectives we're talking about here.
Yes, everyone will definitely
I hope they'll get some leave, Nat, and not just be put straight onto the next case.
Exactly right. Well, thank you both. We're almost at the end of week 24 and possibly very close to the end of this historic trial. We hope you can join us for what could possibly be the final day. That's tomorrow, day 95 of Claremont in Conversation. Until then.
This podcast is hosted by Natalie Bonjolo, produced by Kate Ryan, and recorded in the studios of 7 West Media. Sign up for daily emails and all the latest on the Claremont trial at thewest.com.au. And if local news delivered differently appeals to you, tune into WA's newest morning show, The West Live with Jenna Clark. It's talkback radio, but without the interruptions. Listen live weekdays from 8:45 a.m. on thewest.com.au or catch up with the podcast.